And feel free to grab more food, too. I'm Kevin Vance. I'm the director of the Center for Constitutional Liberty, and I'm very excited about our visiting distinguished scholar for this semester who's going to be speaking tonight. And I'm going to introduce the student constitutional fellow who's going to introduce our speaker. Cecilia Jones is a sophomore English and politics major from the St. Louis area, and she's an honor student and as well as a constitutional fellow, and will be interning at the Heritage Foundation this summer. Cici.
Matteo Salonia is an assistant professor in European and International History at the School of International Studies of the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China. Before joining UNNC, Matteo had taught at the University of Liverpool, Manchester, Metropolitan University, and King's College, London. Matteo's research interests include the economic history of Genoa, medieval constitutionalism, the Spanish Empire, the Iberian world, and Christianity. He is the author of Genoa's Freedom, Entrepreneurship, Republicanism, and the Spanish Atlantic. He has published academic articles on a variety of subjects and periods, including the history of Christianity, comparative world history, 16th century ideas of universal monarchy, and Italian accounts of early Portuguese Asia. He recently published an edited volume about travel literature on Asia from 1200 to the present, which explores themes such as curiosity, identity, and the productions of knowledge about Asian spaces. Professor Salonia is the Spring 2024 Distinguished Visiting Scholar for the Center of Constitutional Liberty.
Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction. And let me take a minute to thank Benedictine College for inviting me here. It's an incredible experience for me to be here on campus. I've been here only for a couple of days, which is why I'm still a bit jet-lagged, which hopefully will not impact the delivery of my paper tonight. But even simply over this past weekend, I've already fallen in love with your campus. It's a great place, fantastic place where you see the love for the church and the love for science and knowledge, how they go hand in hand. So thank you very much for having me. Thanks to John Romano, who's been my first contact, and Kevin Vance, who has worked a lot to organize everything. And thanks to all of you for being here tonight. So today, I want to share with you some of my teaching and research on the history of the idea of human rights. From the start, I should say that I'm aware that in recent decades, all sorts of questionable demands and political claims have been placed under the category of human rights, under the umbrella of human rights. So much so that Catholic philosophers and authors have questioned whether it is prudent and appropriate for us to deploy this language when we engage in public discourse. I'm not here to tell you primarily what I think about this or to join this debate, but I'm here as a historian because I think that it's valuable, it's important for us to have an appropriate understanding of the history of this concept, the history of international law and human rights, and of the contribution of the Catholic Church. If you think of the history of human rights, the first thing that may come to your mind is the most common understanding of how human rights emerged. This is, let's say, the majority view among both the general public and human rights scholars, and it can be well represented by this quotation coming from Lynn Hunt's book, unfortunately very popular book, Inventing Human Rights. The secularist narrative or modernist narrative about the origins of human rights rests upon three pillars. First, that human rights were quite suddenly invented during the Enlightenment, so during the 18th century. Second, that they were invented in opposition to religious institutions, and in particular in opposition to the Catholic Church. And third, that the philosophical framework sustaining human rights, justifying human rights, rests upon secular principles, principles that have nothing to do with theology, that don't owe anything to religion, let alone to Christianity. Obviously, this is not the only view out there. There is an alternative approach, which is instead represented by this second quotation. I'm not going to read them. They're just there for reference. For those of you who want to read something more, but I can give you more references later. This comes from Brian Tierney, who was a distinguished scholar of medieval law and medieval constitutionalism. And in this nice article, Tierney is pointing out that actually some of the assumptions behind the idea of international law and human rights were articulated centuries before the Enlightenment, even as early as the medieval period. And they were not articulated in opposition to the church, but very often thanks to churchmen, canon lawyers, and even some quite exceptional popes like Pope Innocent IV. I don't want to linger too much on these abstract scholarly debates, but I think it's important to realize what's at stake when we try to reconstruct the history of the idea of human rights. For the rest of my paper, I want to bring you to a specific place and a specific time to look at one episode of profound moral crisis in the history of Western civilization, because it's at times of moral crisis that the pace in the definition of universal rights quickens, becomes faster. The place is the Spanish Atlantic, and the time is the 16th century. And this may surprise you because, of course, the Spanish Empire doesn't have a good press. You don't tend to associate the Spanish Empire to the history of human rights. But our perception of the Spanish Empire is influenced, first of all, by the Black Legend constructed by Protestant propagandists since the 16th century. And secondly, by a series of myths, such as one of the myths that you see being present quite early on in this image here that was produced in the 16th century. And that is the myth of a Spanish army, the idea that the Americas were conquered by a well-disciplined, organized, hierarchical army of professional soldiers. You see them in the background there, and the idea is reinforced by that piece of armory here up front, which looks like a piece of ancient Roman armory. The fact is that this is a myth. Matthew Restall has included this myth in his book, The 7 Myths on the Conquest of the Spanish Empire. And instead of being built by an army of professional soldiers, the Spanish Empire in the Americas was built by people whom we usually call conquistadors, by colonists who autonomously and at times illegally formed different bands of launching different expeditions without coordinating each other, and often being in a sort of state of rivalry between each other. These colonists, of course, in certain cases, did have an army, but it wasn't a Spanish army, it was an indigenous army, which is what happened to Cortés as he entered the Aztec Empire and found many allies within it, many discontent groups of Indians. Now, these conquistadors did not leave everything behind, their homes, their families, their friends. They didn't risk their lives crossing the ocean. They didn't see some friends and relatives probably died during the crossing, and they didn't engage in some fighting, which at times was really brutal, in the Americas, to then become farmers. Because if they had wanted to be farmers, they could have stayed back in Extremadura or Andalusia, or Castile, or whatever region of the Iberian Peninsula they were coming from. They left everything behind and they risked their lives because they didn't want to work one more day in their lives. They wanted to be served, not to serve. They wanted to become señores, lords. How to achieve that? They had a pretty clear idea. It wasn't a great idea, but they had it. Plan A was to find huge quantities of gold. Now, the problem is that in Hispaniola, which was the first European settlement, stable settlement in the Americas following the voyages of Christopher Columbus, there simply wasn't enough gold for anybody, for almost anybody to get so rich that they wouldn't have to work anymore. And even after the radius of the Spanish conquest expanded and the Spanish encountered the large indigenous empires of the Aztecs in Mesoamerica and the Inca in Peru, only a handful of Spaniards could really gather enormous, legendary amounts of gold. Plan B. Plan B was the enslavement of large numbers of natives to be sold on the markets of Seville and Barcelona. This plan was also not viable because Queen Isabella, whom you see here depicted in a beautiful wooden statue, the Queen of Castile, actually, so we can say the Queen of Spain, who had befriended, supported, sponsored Christopher Columbus, had also received letters from Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus is really the initiator of the myth of the good savage. He told Isabella that these Indians of what he thought were the outskirts of Asia were innocent, pure beings, uninterested in violence or wealth, who were willing to convert to the Catholic faith and very excited at the prospect of being her subjects. The next thing she knows, these same Indians are brought in chains to be sold as slaves. She was bothered by this in her conscience, consulted the theologians at court, and already by 1500 banned the unjust enslavement of Indians. Now, this doesn't mean that Indians will not be enslaved anymore. A lot of Indians continue to be enslaved, but especially at the outskirts of the moving frontiers of these expanding empires where there weren't royal officers or Catholic missionaries to check what was going on, and the colonists could say that the Indians had been enslaved justly because they had committed some horrible acts or they had been enslaved in just wars. But for those on Hispaniola, the option of enslaving large numbers of Indians was ruled out. What could be the solution to this problem? The early colonies seemed to be on the verge of collapse. They were not viable. There wasn't enough food to feed everybody. The solution came with the institution of the encomienda, and Professor Crane actually told me earlier that some of you have studied the encomienda, so already know what that is. Let me sum it up very briefly. Simply put, the encomienda is a group of natives. By the way, I'm using in this talk interchangeably the word Indian, native, Amerindian. I know that, of course, in the secondary literature, you mostly find the word native, but I still think that it's valuable for us to also use the word Indian because that's the one that we find in the primary sources, and it opens a window on the mentality and the arguments of the people whom we are going to talk about soon. So the encomienda was a group of natives who will remain nominally free and will be assigned to one of the first Spaniards to enter a certain territory, who will then become an encomendero. And the relationship between them was based on the typically medieval idea of reciprocity. The Indians had to offer some tribute in the form of labor or gold or foodstuff, depending on the region. and its resources. And the Spaniard to whom they were entrusted should, first of all, settle down, become a vecino, so a citizen of a town. Stop going around and causing troubles by launching expeditions and depleting the resources of these territories. Secondly, he should have protected his Indians. And thirdly, he should have taught them the Catholic faith. On paper, this was a great solution. It's easy for us to dismiss it, but it was a great solution. Because on paper, it solved all the tensions and problems of early colonial society. The crown will make sure that the colonists settle down and cooperate to the construction of a colonial society that will mirror Spain. The natives will not be enslaved and will benefit from receiving the Catholic faith and the sacraments. And the Spaniards, or the first of them to enter a certain territory, will see guaranteed their elite position in the forming colonial society. In practice, this was a disaster. It was a disaster because of epidemics driving down the numbers of natives. It was a disaster because of the abuses suffered by the natives, the violence suffered by them because they were treated very often as slaves, even though nominally they weren't. And it was a disaster also because, let's be frank, most of these colonies following Columbus in the first waves of migration, how can I put it, were not the best and brightest that Spain had to offer. They were often ex-convicts. Oh, cheers. Now, this is the context for the arrival of the first group of Catholic missionaries on the island of Hispaniola, a group of Dominican friars in 1510. They were horrified by what they found. And in the morning, on the Sunday before Christmas, 1511, in the packed church of Santo Domingo, on the island of Hispaniola, one of them was celebrating Holy Mass, Fray Antonio Montesinos. Now, Montesinos was not a soft talker. He was quite direct. And at the time of the homily, he went to the pulpit, he looked at the colonists in front of him, royal officers, merchants, holders of encomiendas, and including Diego Colón, the son of Christopher Columbus, and he told them the following words, among others. Quote, "I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness. The voice says that you are in mortal sin and live and die in it because of the cruelty and tyranny that you use against these innocent peoples. Tell me by what right or justice do you hold these Indians in such cruel and horrible slavery? By what authority do you wage war against them, peoples who lived mildly and peacefully in their own lands?" You see the myth of the good savage. It's already there. Are these Indians not men? Do they not have rational souls? Are you not obliged to love them as you love yourselves? End of quote. And after saying this, Montesinos left the pulpit, stormed out of the church, thereby refusing to celebrate the Eucharist and to give the sacraments to a bunch of people whom, as far as he was concerned, were unrepentant mortal sinners. What a sin. 1511. This sin should not have happened, according to Lynn Hunt, I suppose. This sin doesn't fit the secularist account of the history of human rights. Following his homily, Montesinos was chased by the angry colonists who went to the humble house of the Dominicans in Santo Domingo and demanded an apology, only to discover that all of the Dominicans agreed with Montesinos. King Ferdinand, back in Spain, the husband of Isabella, who in the meantime had died, initially ordered the Dominicans to keep quiet, not to cause troubles, but after hearing some witnesses at court, he signed the Laws of Burgos. The Laws of Burgos don't look like a declaration of universal human rights. They are simply an attempt to save the encomienda system, to curb the abuses, but they imply that conquered peoples have rights. They are very pragmatic. For example, the king orders that native pregnant women should not work. The king orders that the natives in the encomiendas should have decent food for the sake of their health. He orders that they have a right to rest certain days within a day and certain days within a week. But what the king orders on one side of the ocean is not the same thing on the other side of the ocean. Distance is a factor. The abuse is continued, and the encomienda system is carried over into the mainland after the conquest of the Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire and other territories. So millions of natives get subject to this institution. Yet, the voice of the church also doesn't stop. The debate continues, the controversy continues, and soon there is a broad coalition of churchmen on both sides of the Atlantic campaigning for the rights of the Indians. In fact, the topic now is not only the mistreatment and the abuses suffered by the Indians, but even the question of whether the conquest was just. Even the question of whether the presence, the very presence of Spanish people in this territory is just. So we are in the 16th century, I remind you, and we have an empire, a Catholic empire, questioning the justice of its own success. Let me give you some examples from this coalition of churchmen. Francisco de Vitoria was also a Dominican friar, a very different man than Montesinos. He never visited the Americas. He was not a missionary. He was an intellectual, an academic, a scholar. After studying at the University of Paris, he returned to his home country and was appointed chair of theology at the University of Salamanca, the most prestigious university in Spain. And in the 1530s, he decided to jump into the debate. He didn't do this by a thundering homily or by writing a pamphlet, but by doing what he did best, standing up in a lecture hall and publicly speaking about the problem of the conquest, using scholasticism in both its meanings, in the sense of philosophical system, in the sense of a way of proceeding to the truth. I don't have the time to tell you, to summarize all of his lecture on the Indies, meaning on the Americas. But among other things, he considered the 7 most popular titles for the conquest. These were justifications put forth by the conquistadors and by their representatives at court to say, we have done the right thing. And he refuted all of them. 3 examples. First, the idea that the emperor is master of the whole world. After the death of Ferdinand, Charles of Habsburg became king of Spain, and he had a huge collection of crowns. Among these crowns, in 1519, he also added the title of Holy Roman Emperor. So some of the conquistadors, including famously Hernán Cortés, argued that since their king happened to also be the Holy Roman Emperor, and since the Holy Roman Emperor had a claim to universal jurisdiction, by conquering, for instance, the Aztec Empire, they were simply putting into practice an already existing and legitimate claim by their king. Vitoria was not impressed by this. Vitoria said that if Charles had been master of the whole world, we should have some trace of this, either in natural law, or in divine law, or in human law. There is no trace of this in natural law. There is no trace of this in scriptures or the traditions of the church, the idea that the Habsburg family should rule the entire planet. Right? So Vitoria proceeded to say that in terms of human law, it could be possible, theoretically, if all the commonwealths of the earth were to gather and to elect the same man as their ruler. Then in that case, an argument could be made, but this has not happened. So remember, he's standing up in his lecture hall in front of students who are the sons of the Spanish elite, and he's publicly saying that his king has no claims of authority over the new world. Second claim by the colonists, that the Pope could parcel out territories and distribute them among secular princes. Vitoria believes that this argument is even more wrong-headed. It's a category mistake, because the Pope doesn't have temporal authority, with some exceptions. The Pope is primarily a spiritual authority. Now, some people argue that the Pope could at least redistribute the lands of sinners. And here I need to quote from Vitoria, because he is usually very, very dry, but he uses some irony, and he answers, quote, "The Pope cannot confiscate the lands of sinners and give them to other princes. If he could, since every country is full of sinners, kingdoms could be exchanged every day." And he continues, "Such sins, the ones of which the Indians were accused, are more serious in Christians who know them to be sins than in the barbarians who do not know." End of quote. So he's saying not only you are wrong, but if you were right, the first people who should be dispossessed by the Pope should be Christian kingdoms, not barbarian kingdoms. Meaning, here he's using the term barbarian in a neutral fashion, in the 16th century fashion. So simply meaning somebody who isn't under the category of Christian, Jew, or Muslim. Third example, the title of discovery, which is the one with which we are more familiar. Some activists today think that they are the first ones ever to denounce this title of discovery, but Vitoria had already rejected it in the 16th century. It's just that we don't study Vitoria in our textbooks. Title of discovery was actually based on the Roman principle of occupatio. The ancient Romans had wondered how private property begins in the first place, and they had come up with this idea of the occupatio. The colonists said, we have found these lands, they were not owned by anybody, so now they are ours through an act of occupatio. Vitoria's answer is that, yes, sure, occupatio as a principle is helpful to grasp the truth of this part of natural law, the part dealing with private property. And St. Thomas Aquinas had defended private property in a fallen world. But the detail here missed by the colonists is that somebody else had already performed an act of occupatio, which is the natives themselves. And Vitoria argues that they had the faculty of reason. If they had the faculty of reason, they were created in the image and likeness of God. If they are created in the image and likeness of God, they have dominion, a 16th century expression for, we may say, to make a long story short, for rights, the right to self-government and property. How did Vitoria know that they had the faculty of reason? He never went to the Americas, because this coalition of churchmen produced a lot of knowledge about the Americas. And through their network, they were disseminating this knowledge. Dominicans, Franciscans, he had read reports, pamphlets. He had read private correspondence, letters. And of course, he had heard from the voices of his brothers who came back from the Americas. And he says in his lecture that as far as he knew, these Indians had already institutions. Marriages, judges, laws, writing, art, a form of religion, and they could grasp abstract concepts, which is a sign of rationality, so the concept of peace or the concept of justice. So you see what Vitoria is doing here. He's redeploying natural law in an anti-imperial fashion. This is the first systematic self-criticism of an empire. In the process, an idea of international law emerges, an international order where human communities are of equal standing despite their cultural differences. And the fiction of a world emperor is removed. Not that this fiction was unique to Western Europe. Just think of the Aztec cosmology or the idea of emperor that the Chinese had. Next example is, I may be using this wrong, or it turned off. No? Well, I'll continue without, there it is. My fellow Italian, Alessandro Farnese, Pope Paul III. So you see, this network of information, disseminating information about what was going on in the Americas reaches further than just the Iberian world, further than Spain. And the Pope in Rome has heard things that trouble him. In 1537, he issues the bull Sublimis Deus. Now, this document had a controversial afterlife. It was arguably recalled, but precisely because of the scandal that it provoked at the Spanish court. And anyway, what we are doing here is a page of intellectual history, so it doesn't really matter. What matters is that the Pope actively contributes to this brainstorming, to this thinking, to this articulation of ideas related to universal rights. In the document, he calls the colonists satellites of the enemy of the human race. Who is the enemy of the human race? Yeah, the devil. So the Pope is calling Spanish colonists satellites of the devil. He says, quote, "I define and declare that the Indians and all other people who may later be discovered by Christians are by no means to be deprived of their liberty or the possession of their property, even though they be outside of the faith of Jesus Christ, and that they may and should freely and legitimately enjoy their liberty and the possession of their property." End of quote. So by the late 1530s, the Spanish living in the American territories know that they are losing the argument. They are losing the argument. More and more royal legislation limiting their authority. The most famous professors in Spain publicly saying that the conquest was unjust, and now the Pope calling them satellites of the devil. But I cannot finish the talk without at least mentioning Bartolomé de las Casas, who's perhaps the most famous of this group of churchmen. Las Casas had an incredible life. He was himself a colonist. His father had followed Christopher Columbus very early on, was a merchant. The Las Casas family did very well in the Caribbean islands. He owned a mine and a ranch. He had slaves, and he had been entrusted an encomienda, so a group of Indians. In other words, Las Casas was one of the targets of Montesinos in his thundering homily. Las Casas was also a secular priest, perhaps one of the first secular clergymen in the New World. In 1514, while reading the Bible, he had a profound moral crisis or crisis of conscience, a radical conversion, and he gave up his property. He gave up his encomienda, he freed his slaves, later he joined the Dominican order, and he dedicated the rest of his life to campaigning for the Indians. Now, he did so in a very unique way, in a very flamboyant, controversial way. And he had mainly two objectives. First, he wanted to obtain from the king a document giving him a monopoly of entrance along a stretch of the Venezuelan coast. He had this idea that if the Indians could only meet good friars and some well-intentioned Spanish farmer rather than these bloodthirsty and gold-thirsty colonists, they will be befriended, they will learn the faith, and then the Spanish could withdraw and let them govern themselves. I know that the idea sounds crazy, but what's even more crazy is that Charles actually signed that document. He was convinced by this, or probably he was bothered by Las Casas so much that in the end he gave in. But at any rate, I don't have the time now to tell you the story, which ends in a disaster, but maybe in the question time we can talk about that. The second objective that he had was to disseminate at the Spanish court and throughout Spanish society images of colonial violence. And in this he was so successful that Protestant pamphleteers and engravers used Las Casas to build the black legend against Catholic Spain, which is paradoxical, but it's what happened. When scholars look at Las Casas, at his text, they stress explosive rhetoric, graphic descriptions of violence in really kind of disturbing details, and the strategies of exaggeration, never believe Las Casas about the numbers he gives, and of empathy, trying to have his readers empathize with the victims of Spanish imperialism. And I don't have a problem with these interpretations, that all these things are there in the texts. But I think that there's something else. I believe that even in the short account of the destruction of the Indies, his most famous pamphlet, theological arguments and biblical imagery are fundamental in his articulation of universal rights. So I agree with Lawrence Clayton, who has pointed out that Las Casas saw himself as an Old Testament prophet. But it will be, how can I put it? It will be unpleasant or not very palatable for many scholars to admit that a person who saw himself as an Old Testament prophet contributed to our understanding of universal rights. For example, in his short account, there are images from the gospel all over the place. The natives are called gentle lambs. The Spaniards are, quote, wolves, tigers, and savage lions who have not eaten meat for days. End of quote. It's classic Las Casas. If you have read him, you know. If you have not read him, you may think, wow, that's something. At some point in the text, he says that the natives are, quote, created in God's image and redeemed by his blood. Think about it. Created in God's image and redeemed by his blood. Ultimately, this is why they have rights. This is the foundation of universal rights in Las Casas. It is rooted in an idea of spiritual brotherhood, in the cross of Christ, in the self-sacrificial love of Christ. Another example is the use of the word Christian. He deliberately replaces the word Spaniard with the word Christian when detailing the most horrendous crimes supposedly committed by the Spanish colonists. So you read, for instance, quote, "the despotic and diabolical behavior of the Christians." And again, those who have traveled to this part of the world pretending to be Christians. And again, the reason the Christians have murdered on such a vast scale and killed anyone and everyone in their way is purely and simply greed, end of quote. Why would they do that? Hundreds of years later, if we are Christians, we're still bothered. When we read this, we feel a bit hurt by reading this. And yes, that's the point, in part, because he wanted his audience at court to intervene, to act, to do something. He wanted the abolition of the encomienda system. He didn't want the government to continue to parcel out people to colonists. But there is another reason why he's using the word Christian in this way, I believe. There is a fundamental difference between Las Casas' account of justice and injustice and our contemporary secularist account of justice and injustice. In Las Casas, violence is a spiritual issue. It is the consequence of sin. And in Christians, it is a failure to imitate Christ. It's a failure in their imitation of Christ. So what did Las Casas obtain, or all the others obtain? In 1542, King Charles signed the Leyes Nuevas, the new laws, which are a fundamental document in the history of human rights. Through this document, Charles abolished the encomienda system, outlawed all kinds of enslavement for the Indians, and he imagined a different constitutional order for the Spanish kingdom. It is opportune for us to approach historical documents with a pinch of cynicism, but there's also the opposite. We cannot approach them without any cynicism, but there is also the opposite problem of being too cynical. This document cost Charles dearly. It cost the empire dearly. When it was read by the representative of Charles in Peru, the angry colonists assaulted him and cut his head, which was paraded around Peru. This was, of course, an act of treason and the beginning of a bloody civil war, because from the perspective of the elite among the colonists, Charles was taking away from their sons the guarantee that they will not have to work. So, in conclusion, wow, I'm being even more efficient than what you had allowed me to be. What have I done this evening? I have sketched one episode of Moral Crisis that sparked reflections on the universal rights of human beings and human communities. If you think back at the three pillars upon which the secularist narrative of the history of human rights rests, just try to remember them and compare them to what we have seen in this presentation. We've seen three things. First, a longer history of human rights discourses. We are 2 centuries before the Enlightenment. Second, the contribution of the Catholic Church. Not all churchmen were for the abolition of the encomienda. Not all the missionaries liked Las Casas. Some of them called him a liar. But overall, it is undeniable that a coalition of churchmen contributed decisively to the articulation of some of those assumptions that we take for granted when thinking about international law and human dignity. And third, perhaps we can see that human rights are not sustained by a secularist framework, but by assumptions and concepts that come from Christian theology and Christian philosophy. So perhaps the rights of man are only sustainable when juxtaposed with the rights of God. I hope that this was interesting. Thanks for your attention, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
My name is John Welty. I'm a senior here at Benedictine. I wanted to say thank you for your talk. This is a little bit more, I guess, of a political question a little bit, but it seems like, especially here in America, there's been a lot of, I guess, forgetting of who our rights really come from, and a lot of people now believe that our rights come from the government instead of from, something else, like God. So I guess I don't know if you had any thoughts about how a good way to kind of remind people of the fact where our rights come from, and then also to help preserve those rights.
Wow, that's quite a heavy question. Yeah, thank you. I think that we need to reclaim history as a subject that belongs also to apologetics. And we have to create spaces where Catholic education can thrive. We cannot simply hand over education and culture to the monopoly of the state. It's too dangerous to do that. When you do that, you end up with having only certain narratives being inserted into school curricula. I know that in the US, you have a very healthy homeschool movement and very healthy alternatives to state schools, by which I mean public schools. Sorry, in different countries, state schools and public schools may mean different things, but you know what I mean. The problem with what we have in Europe, for example, which is, in Italy surely, is that, yes, we do have a right to open a private school if we want to, but private schools are almost indistinguishable from public schools. They follow the same curricula, they have the same textbooks, very often they share the same teachers. So we need to reclaim spaces where we educate, even not necessarily in a formal way, where we share knowledge. Where we share knowledge that is not necessarily received the stamp of approval from the government. That's my suggestion, and that's my humble suggestion. Not that this will solve the whole issue that you described, but it's a good start.
Thank you very much for your talk. My question was just actually, about our sort of this more secular version of human rights, because as you talked about the Catholic version of human rights, sort of where it truly originated was sort of with the Spanish and how they had to deal with their Indian subjects in the 1500s. But our modern, a more secular version of human rights, in the wording, it sounds the same to the Catholic understanding, but in practice and in the true understanding, it's very different. So what exactly is sort of how exactly, just a brief view of where the secular modern view of human rights came from, and that sort of difference between the Catholic understanding of human rights?
If I understand your question, I will answer that. If I understand you correctly, I will answer that the secular idea of human rights comes from the same place. It comes from Christianity. It's just that it's not crediting Christianity. The Enlightenment was, in part, an attempt to hold on to the Christian worldview without Christian theology. This is partly what Alasdair MacIntyre says as well. And so the problem is that the Enlightenment project fails because there isn't a strong enough framework without God. Why should we recognize the dignity of other human beings, ultimately the existence of a moral order outside of our minds, if we don't believe in a creator who is also the lawgiver for that law? Every law has a lawgiver. Who's the lawgiver of the moral law if you don't believe in God? This gets too philosophical maybe, and I'm not qualified to talk too much about this because I'm not a philosopher. But so historically, the secularist view of human rights comes from the same place. It comes from this stream. And people who have tried to take the first steps at secularizing international law, like Hugo Grocio, were definitely influenced by Vitoria. Even Locke indirectly was. So I hope this answers your question.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So I am the product of one of those Catholic homeschool educations, and I remember in my American history class, probably in like 10th grade, learning about this sort of thing, and I remember my very Catholic textbook sort of basically saying what you said in a much clumsier and less nuanced and articulate way. You know, being like, well, yeah, the encomienda system was bad, and here are these Catholics who argued against it, you know, Las Casas and whatnot. But also there was still this strain of like really not wanting to criticize what other Catholics had done, you know, and call a spade and say, this is unjust. So I guess I'm just curious if you have any further thoughts on how as Catholics, maybe especially in kind of secondary education, talking about this with young people, how do we strike that balance between, you know, acknowledging the massive contribution of the church to this sort of thing, while also being frank about the sins and the injustices and the evils that have sort of existed alongside that for our history?
But the question is, who says that those acts are evil outside of a Christian worldview? What is your standard and where is it coming from? This is what the secularists have to answer. Who said that empire building is intrinsically unjust? Unless you have a standard which helps you not only to criticize empire building when you are the victim of it, but also when you are the perpetrator. So I don't know if you are familiar with Tom Holland's book. And Tom Holland, who isn't even a Catholic as far as I know, has made brilliantly this point, not only in his book, but also in many public appearances, that even today, secularists continue to be Christian. They want to hold on to what they like about Christianity without Christianity and without admitting it. But who said that empire building is wrong? That's the first suggestion that I will give you. And of course, the Spanish Empire is the subject of a black legend, and that black legend starts from some truth. The injustice and the abuses and the massacres and the horrible violence that was perpetrated in many cases. And but that is not what makes the Spanish Empire unique, because those massacres and those attitudes, that exploitation happened in different forms at different times and in different empires. Yet what makes arguably the Spanish Empire unique is this wave of self-criticism and how it becomes articulated into these thoughts that contribute to our image of a world where different polities have the same standing and have the same right to self-government and have to somehow find a way to live together peacefully and to interact peacefully. I hope this has not gone off topic from your question.
Yes, thank you for coming. That was really, really interesting and very enlightening. So I had a question concerning what would these churchmen like Las Casas, what would they have to say about practices of the natives that were like objectively immoral, like human sacrifice? And that's not to say that in Europe they weren't killing innocent people and there were wars of religion and all that going on. And as Montaigne talks about, sometimes the Europeans were more brutal than the native peoples. But the native peoples were practicing either ritual sacrifice, as in the case of the Aztecs, or more of a social communal cannibalistic practice, as in the case of some of the native peoples in Middle America and South America. So what would these churchmen have to say about those practices? Would they say that the Spaniards had a responsibility to make sure that they were eliminated, even as the native peoples achieved self-government and a certain degree of autonomy, or were they mostly converted at this point, so was that not a problem?
That's a great question. Let me give you two examples. Vitoria, in his lecture, says that, well, addresses the idea that the so-called Indians are not true masters, meaning they don't have dominion, the right to self-government and property, because they are bad sinners. And his answer is the following, that the idea that rights depend on grace is heretical. So he is in the 1530s between Luther's rebellion and the beginning of the Counter-Reformation or Catholic Reformation, and he is publicly saying, you know, that those who disagree with him on this, so those who say that the bad sins, meaning, you know, things like cannibalism, were a justification for the conquest, are heretical, because losing grace through a mortal sin doesn't take away from your civil rights. That's his argument. And he says that the Bible has many examples of people like Solomon and David who were bad sinners but are still called kings. He also says that mortal sin does not deprive a man of spiritual jurisdiction. That means, I don't know if you're familiar with the early heresy of Donatism, that means that a bad priest can still celebrate the Eucharist, and a bad bishop can still consecrate a priest. So if the loss of grace doesn't destroy spiritual jurisdiction, how can it destroy civil jurisdiction, which has less to do with it? Second example from Las Casas, which of course is much less sophisticated and than Vitoria, and he's much more to the point. In 1550, because as late as 1550, King Charles is still organizing debates. He's putting together committees to debate whether the conquests are just. He's seriously taking in consideration to stop the conquests. It's incredible because the conquests are continuing at the outskirts, like northern Mexico and southern Chile. It's incredible. So he puts together this committee to discuss this, and in 1550 you have the famous Valladolid debate. On the one side there is Las Casas, on the other side there is the best and brightest representative of the colonists, that is Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, who interestingly is not a churchman, he's a humanist, an expert on Aristotle. And one of the things that Sepúlveda says is that the conquest is just and the violence is necessary because of cannibalism and human sacrifices and all of these horrible sins. And Las Casas comes in, they never meet, they always witness in front of the committee at different times. And Las Casas comes in and he has already read the accusations moved by Sepúlveda. And incredibly, Las Casas compares favorably the Aztecs, the Indians, with the Romans. And he says that the Indians have large cities, beautiful industries, and wise laws. Now, about that business of human sacrifices, he says that the ancestors of the Spaniards before Christianity did the same things according to classical sources. And actually, he even tries to justify human sacrifices by saying that they show a form of religion and piety on the part of the Aztecs. They therefore fail to constitute evidence for the lack of understanding and free will. These are some of the answers given. So, I mean, as you say, by this point, it's impossible to deny that the Aztecs were killing tens of thousands of people every year through human sacrifices, right? So he's not trying to deny that. He's trying to, I don't want to say justify that, but he's, I told you what he said. By the way, if I can just have another point, I'm not trying to correct you. I know that you are right when you say the wars of religion in theory, but my suggestion is that we stop calling them wars of religion. There's a great article by William Cavanaugh who shows how the wars of religion were not about religion. And we call them wars of religion because the people who unfolded the project of the modern state, of this Leviathan with a previously unthinkable monopoly of jurisdiction, education, violence, and everything else that the state has acquired, wanted to remove the possibility of using violence for religious purposes so that violence can be deployed for the aims of the state. But the wars of religion were not about religion. So much so that Catholics sometimes are allied with Protestants. And so they are wars that follow a process through which the state has taken over religion. And that's why religion has become so politicized. Not only in Protestant countries where you have princes dictating religious policies, but even in some Catholic countries where unfortunately the church between the end of the 15th and the beginning of the 16th century was forced to give up large slices of its jurisdictional independence. So in Spain and Portugal, you have the patronato and the padronado, through which the kings decide the bishops. And in France, you have the Concordat of Bologna, if I'm not mistaken, in the early 16th century, through which the Gallican church takes shape, so the bishops have to be confirmed by the king. So it's because of this process that then religion becomes politicized. It's not the other way around, because those who have formed this myth of the wars of religion want us to believe that religion is intrinsically violent and that therefore we need the state as a peacemaker, but it's the other way around.
Hello. Hello.
Hi.
I have a comment and a question at the end. Well, today happens to be Queen Isabel's birthday. She would have been today 573 years old. She was
Can you repeat?
Queen Isabel.
Oh, Queen Isabella, yeah.
It was
yeah.
her birthday
Yeah.
today, so it's a nice day for you to talk about her. And, because of the vision that she had and her strong Catholic faith, that the enterprise of the Americas was done, and the magnificent work that Spain did in the Americas, I think, cannot be surpassed, and not seen as a colony, but as truly a Spain. Because, as you know very well, the loss of the Indies and the laws of Burgos and afterwards the laws of the Indies, and firstly with the codicil of Queen Isabel
Yeah.
at the very beginning.
Yeah.
The
In 1506,
natives,
yeah.
the natives were not, subjects. They were not, slaves, but they were Spanish. I don't share so much a sympathy on Bartolomé de las Casas just because he did exaggerate very much on his work. Although the conclusion that you bring out of his work, I agree with you. But it did make a lot of damage to Spain, which did a magnificent, work in the Americas by 50, 70 years of the first conquest. You have already universities and many things, and the Indians in Peru in particular were part of the Spanish nobility afterwards and related, so there's a long history there. But I would like you, in honor of our dear Queen, if you can expand a little bit more on her codicil as the basis of this human rights law, which is truly in a nutshell there. And then, of course, it was expanded by Charles V, and Philip II afterwards, which was on the other side incredible that Charles V would, as a true Catholic, would hold onto the confessionary, the whole conquest and hold it for 3 years. In Spanish, there is a saying that the Americans first had to be exorcised before they could be evangelized. So I think it goes a little bit to the question that the other girl had on the human sacrifices and all of that. So if you can expand a little bit on the codicil and on the Queen Isabel. Thank you.
Well, you've already said a lot. What I can expand is by saying that the codicil established that the Indians should not be enslaved, they should not be mistreated. That was the last will of the Queen. And I think what helps is to see Isabella's vision in its entirety, which was very similar to Christopher Columbus' vision. They understood each other because they had the same mindset. And the mindset was not geared towards a project of empire building. This is what people sometimes misunderstand. They think that Isabella had in mind the construction of an empire, the actual conquest of peoples. But what Isabella and Columbus had in mind was not building an empire on the other side of the ocean, but rather freeing Jerusalem. This is what Isabella wanted to do. This is what she wanted as her legacy, and this is what she also left in her last writings. If you read some of the letters that Columbus wrote to the monarchs, already from 1493, he ends his description of the islands that he has found by reminding them the true reason for the enterprise, which is freeing Jerusalem. The objective was to establish a factory in the sense of a commercial outpost in one of the wealthy ports of Asia, Hangzhou, or in Japan, one of the places that Columbus had read about in Marco Polo. And Isabella shared this view, which was not ultimately a commercial view, but was a spiritual view. And so I think it's important that we understand this. Otherwise, we think that the objective was an empire, but rather the objective was, I think that to use their words, it was the glory of God through the liberation of Jerusalem. And this could be accomplished if the Spanish could initiate a trade between themselves and Asia, thereby making money that will be reinvested into a crusade. This is a point that you made me think of, and then I think that is useful to understand their mindset. And it explains some of their reactions, actually, and also explains why I think it's reasonable to use the word Indians in a context like this lecture. I'm not talking about, if we were talking about US history, maybe not, but in this context, I think it's defensible to use at times the word Indians together with natives, because it helps us to think precisely about this, that Columbus and originally Isabella had a different plan in mind.
Thank you so much for giving your talk tonight. I just had a question regarding Christopher Columbus. So you said he had perpetuated the myth of this good savage, and so he went and talked to Queen Isabel and was telling her how Native Americans were really good people who wanted to be good subjects of Spain. And I was just wondering from that how we now have this villain that Christopher Columbus is. How did he go from the person perpetuating this myth so villainous?
There is a great book by Carol Delaney, which is called Columbus and the Quest for Jerusalem. That's a great book that I suggested by Carol Delaney, who looks at the. She was actually an anthropologist, I think, not a historian, from Stanford University, and she's an even Catholic, and she talks about Columbus' reaction to the discovery and his attempts to work out the place where he was and his interactions with the natives. I think that Las Casas himself is responsible in part for the negative views that we have on Columbus, because Las Casas is the first one who accuses Columbus of having committed errors and mistakes and crimes, even though Las Casas doesn't have for once, he has maybe a slightly nuanced picture. So he doesn't condemn completely Columbus, but he initiates this criticism about Columbus and the treatment, and specifically with regard to the treatment of the natives. Columbus was a Genoese with a heavy Portuguese accent when he spoke with the Spanish. So the Spanish weren't particularly happy to take orders from him. And of course, even though at the beginning he ordered them to respect the natives and to not to launch expeditions into the interiors of the islands and to wait for his return, and he attempted to govern the islands in a way that was perhaps clumsy, because his skills were not really those of an administrator. He was a great sailor, but not an administrator. But I would say, to answer your question, that maybe the origin of Columbus, of the view of Columbus that we have, is in Las Casas. Yeah. And then, of course, it continued with the Black Legend built by the Protestants using Las Casas.
All right. So I want to thank again Professor Salonia. And he'll be here all week, so make sure you get a time to talk to him. And also to invite everyone to do this again tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. Justice Caleb Stegall from the Kansas Supreme Court will be here in this room. So thank you again.
Thanks a lot.